Hello, everyone. My guest today is Paul Smith, a YouTuber who, in my view, has elevated the medium to new heights. Paul's videos skillfully weave together diverse topics such as history, metrology, esotericism, and of course, nutrition. Paul is, in fact, the man behind two YouTube channels. Nutrient Nirvana is health-focused channel reflecting his deep interest in nutrition, and Esoteric Explorer, home to Paul's wide-ranging history-related interviews, most notably his weekly Sunday streams at 7 p.m., a favourite for myself and many others. Hello, Paul. Thanks for coming on.
Hi Richard, thanks for asking me.
You're welcome. Paul, you also have excellent taste. You're a big supporter of my channel, for instance. Much appreciated. And I suppose you've brought a new lease of life to this channel in many ways with your support. And it's about time then that I finally have you on.
That's very kind of you to say so, Richard. Your channel is brilliant and it's definitely accelerated my learning when it comes to King Arthur.
That's great to hear, Paul. So a lot of people are calling you Smithy now. Can I call you Smithy?
You certainly can, mate, yeah.
Right, there's so much to talk to you about because your interests are so diverse. Um, can we start with nutrition, maybe?
Yeah, sure.
Your earliest channel, Nutrient Nirvana, is nutrition focused, and you still stream there too. Most recently, with a series of videos with the Gap's coach Emma Goodwin.
Hmm.
What drew you towards nutrition?
Wow, okay. So I'd probably be going back about 15 to 20 years ago now. I came across by accident a lecture online by a doctor called Dr. Joel Wallach. And the lecture, I think you can still find it probably on YouTube, is called Dead Doctors Don't Lie. And it's basically him talking about various ailments and health conditions and illnesses and pointing to the very real fact that many of them are a result of a nutritional deficiency. Dr. Joe Wallach was originally a vet and I think he was working in Africa, and I think he won the Nobel Prize at one point, and he was treating animals with nutrients, primarily with minerals, and was having great success doing it. And so, he thought to himself, well, if this works for animals, why wouldn't it work for humans? So he took it from there basically. So that was my kind of the first opening, if you like, into the world of nutrition. And then I started researching online and looking into stuff. And I tried a couple of supplements for myself. I think the very first one I tried was a magnesium spray, which is very popular now. And at the time, I used to wake up in the middle of the night screaming into my pillow, which is never a good look, because I had muscle cramps in my calves, and it was happening quite regular. So I read that magnesium was very good at relaxing the joints and the muscles. So I got this spray, and late at night before I went to bed, I would apply it to my calf muscles, and the problem didn't re-emerge. So that was like, wow, this really works. And I think the second thing I tried was something called fulvic minerals, which is something that my company sells. And these are soil-based minerals, all the trace elements that used to be in our soils prior to modern agricultural farming. And again, it was a very kind of cleansing experience because fulvic minerals cleanse you out at the cellular level. So, and I also noticed a small improvement in my eyesight at the time as well. So I was highly impressed by this and really got into it as a result of all that. And then about 6 or 7 years ago, 6 years ago now, I started my company, Nutrient Nirvana, and it's very, very focused on providing people with clean, pure supplements. So we try to avoid fillers, etc. Everything is completely natural. We sell organic herbs now and various supplements. Um, we're, we're not a company that sells, you go on some websites and you'll find a company that sells or provides about 500 different supplements. Well, we're not like that. My main focus is mainly on the essentials that everyone needs. So, minerals like magnesium and zinc, vitamins like vitamin C and D and the B vitamin complex, all the things that are not always easy to get from food now, sadly. So, and I've seen nutrients work for people now so many times. Um, there's a saying that our bodies are never running short of a pharmaceutical, but we're all starving for nutrients, and that is so true. And they say that if you find the job you love, you'll never work again. And that's pretty much. I mean, there's obviously there's jobs I have to do in my job that are not the most exciting, but I'm a strong believer in nutrition for people. I've seen it work so many times, um, and unfortunately, the food at the moment, the food chain, there's lots of problems with it. Basically, I've said about the lack of nutrients now in our soil, which is all it's been talked about now by the National Academy of Sciences. They've warned, I think, that we've only got about 60 to 70 harvests left in this country before the soil was completely bereft of minerals. So it's quite a worrying scenario. Um, there are now regenerative farmers working out there, and they're putting the minerals back into the soil. Funnily enough, one of the ways they do this is by adding fulvic and humic acid. They add that to the soil now, which is basically fulvic minerals, and they're adding Epsom salts to the soil, so to replenish it with magnesium, because magnesium is such an important mineral for human health, and most people are very deficient in it. So yeah, so I'm a huge fan of nutrition, and I'm loving doing what I'm doing, and yeah, I think everyone should be taking one or two supplements now just to, safeguard themselves.
So you're an advocate for supplements and also healthy eating, and I
Yeah.
think you have a particular interest in the GAPS protocol. Am I right?
Yes, I do. Yeah, I came across one of my very first ever interviews on YouTube. I interviewed a lady called Dr. Natasha Campbell McBride, who is a Russian lady married to a Scotsman, and she is a neurologist and a nutritional scientist. And I believe that one of her children was born with autism, and so she started to look into it very, very deeply. And she came up with an eating protocol for people suffering with those type of conditions and illnesses. And from what I can make out, it's been very, very successful. And so GAP stands for Gut and Physiology Syndrome, or it can stand for Gut and Psychology Syndrome, because there's a great connection between the gut and the brain. The gut-brain axis is called. So, you've heard the saying, you are what you eat, and there's a lot to be said for that. So, it's very, it's centered really on like an ancestral diet, but it's very, very animal foods based as well. So, it involves making things like homemade stock and bone broth and things like that, because those type of foods are very healing for the gut. And it's quite surprising. I can't go into any detail about that on your channel, mate, because I don't want to get you into trouble. But there are some amazing testimonials out there of people that have used this diet and have made some significant recoveries. That's all I can really say.
Okay, brilliant.
Yeah.
Now, another one of your passions is music. Is that right?
Yeah, I guess so, really. I mean, I still love music. I haven't played music myself now since really since the start of COVID, when my life changed quite dramatically. Um, but yeah, I've played music for most of my life. I've taught classical guitar. That's kind of like the main thing that I did. But I also was a drummer in a couple of bands over the years, and so I've played drums quite a lot, and I've really loved playing the drums. I miss the drums more than the guitar. Um, so yeah, so apparently. my mum told me that I sang before I spoke as a baby.
Oh, really?
So I guess, yeah, I guess I've always been into music, and yeah, I love it. I listen to music every day. I find it very therapeutic. You know, if I'm doing some paperwork or whatever, I'll have the headphones on and I'll be listening to lots of different stuff. Um, yeah, it's great for the soul.
Are you going to be bringing a musical element to the CV at some point?
Well, I don't know about that. I've recorded a Christmas song
Oh, wow.
with my sister singing it, and my mum playing the sleigh bells, and me. So basically, somebody you know that's been on my channel, Dr. John Hart, he wrote a Christmas poem, and he asked me to turn it into a song, so I did, and I've recorded it with my mum and sister, so we're gonna play it on the Christmas show on
Oh,
the 21st of
brilliant.
December. So that might be something to look forward to. I don't know.
Oh, yeah, look forward to that. Oh,
Yeah,
see, you
cool.
mentioned the guitar. Obviously, your formative years coincided with the heyday of one of the most revered British guitar-based bands of all time, didn't it? I'm talking about the incomparable Status Quo.
Funnily enough, my dad saw their second ever gig in Cornwall. There was 14 people in a pub, and he said they were really good. Um, I think they started out as quite a rocky sort of band, almost like Hawkwind or something like that.
Oh, wow.
But it kind of descended into pop music, and I suppose they wanted to make some money.
They probably had a great influence on you then, in one way or another.
Possibly, yeah, possibly.
Okay. No, in all seriousness, what are your musical influences then?
Wow. Okay, that's a really good question, and there were so many, so I'll try and narrow it down a bit. The first major influence on me, proper musical influence, was actually Prince, and that was when I was a teenager, and I was just so impressed by the way he played guitar, and I think that's largely been forgotten just how good he was on the guitar. I think Eric Clapton once said that he jammed with Jimi Hendrix, but the best guitarist he'd ever come across was Prince. And the amazing thing about Prince was the guitar was his second instrument. His first instrument was the piano. He was an amazing drummer. He could pretty much play anything. And the music is timeless as well. A lot of the music still stands up today. So he was an amazing musician. Um, then I got a bit older and I got into indie music at the time in the 90s. So your favourites, Oasis, obviously, and I liked Blur a lot, and the Super Furry Animals. They were a great Welsh band, and one or two others, and electronic music. And then I started to take the classical guitar more seriously because at this time I think I was an estate agent in my 20s. And I got into playing the guitar again, and I'd always play classical guitar because my dad had a classical guitar that he could play one song on, and that was it. And I taught myself up to about grade seven standard, and then had a few lessons, passed my grade eight. This is going back about 20 years now. And in my 30s, I started teaching part time, and I discovered that I was quite good at it. So one thing led to another, and I ended up being a full-time classical guitar teacher, working in schools, in music academies, um, and yeah, it was a really really good time. Unfortunately, COVID kind of put a stop to that. I went on to Zoom for a while and taught on Zoom, but I found it very challenging to teach a musical instrument properly on Zoom when you're not in the room with someone. So that kind of came to an end, and that's when I started Nutrient Nirvana around that sort of time. But yeah, but music, I mean, I love classical music, I love jazz a lot, I really love British folk music now, really into that sort of stuff. Anything really, not so much rap music, but anything, anything else, and you know, I love it.
Great. Now, Smithy, let's change direction a bit now. In Whitechapel, East London, between August and November of 1888, there were five murders so brutal they will be remembered forever. The victims were Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, the canonical five victims of a perpetrator dubbed Jack the Ripper. You have a great interest in these murders, don't you?
I do, yeah, mainly because my granddad gave me a book. Ah, I should have got that. I should have got that out. It's a book by Stephen Knight, and it's called Jack the Ripper: The Final Solution. He gave it to me when I was about 13 or 14. I don't know what he was thinking of because you've got some very graphic photos in there as well, sadly. But yeah, that was the initial thing that triggered my interest in it. Um, the Stephen Knight book, The Final Solution, is basically the book that a lot of the Jack the Ripper films have been based on. So films like From Hell with Johnny Depp. Before that, you had Murder by Decree with, I think, Christopher Plummer and James Mason, which is probably the best one. And that's based on the Royal Conspiracy, which I don't particularly put a lot of faith into.
Was that the one about Prince Albert Victor, was it?
Well, it's kind of like there's various theories within that particular theory. So some people say that Albert was involved, which has more or less been disproved now because apparently for at least some of the murders, he was at Balmoral Castle in Scotland with Victoria. You've also got Walter Sickert mixed up in it, which is a bit more interesting for me because it looks as though he definitely had a very strong interest in the murders anyway, which I can go into in a minute if you want.
I think
Um,
he
but
depicted some of the scenes in his art, is that right?
well, I know there's a painting called Jack the Ripper's Bedroom, which he painted while I think he was in Camden in London. But he did it in his bedroom, and apparently the story goes the landlady told him that Jack the Ripper once stayed in this room. So that doesn't really like connect Walter Sickert to the murders as such. But some of his paintings from around that time are kind of Ripperesque, if you like. They're very suggestive of basically prostitutes and murder. Um, so he was very kind of interested in it, and I believe that he was in Sweden in the very early part of the 20th century, something like 15 years after the murders. And in Sweden, for some reason, this book came out, which had the mortuary photographs of the murder victims. It was the first time they'd ever been published anywhere, and he actually got a copy of it. So he was the first person, or he saw the book that first showed the terrible scenes in the mortuary for the murder victims, and the one of Mary Kelly in her bedroom where she was murdered. She
Can
was
I?
the only victim. Go
Oh,
on.
sorry to interrupt. Can I just ask about the modus operandi of the killer then? It seems to be deep slash wounds to the throat, mutilation to the abdomen and genitals, removal of organs, and facial mutilations. Is that basically it?
Um, in the Mary Kelly murder, I think the heart was removed as well. I mean, that was the most violent murder by far. If you're of a squeamish disposition, don't look up the murder photograph because it's absolutely horrific. So, I mean, Randy Williams is somebody that's written about this, and I put a lot of, I think he's come up with the most interesting theory so far as to how, who, and why the murders took place and who committed them. Um, so yeah, I'd look into that if anyone's interested. Um,
We'll
there's
go
one
into
thing.
that in a little bit. I was gonna ask how many victims do you think there were? Because Sir Melville MacNaughton, who's the assistant chief constable of the Met and the head of the CID, he said that the Whitechapel murderer had five victims and five victims only. The true extent of the murders isn't clear at all, is it? Perhaps obscured by a more widespread violence against women in East London at the time.
Yeah, so I think from late 1887 through to 1891, there were a series of murders, something like 14 or 15, but they call them the five canonical murders, as you just referred to with Melvin McNaughton. Um, but from what I've seen so far, going on various Jack the Ripper websites online, the casebook being probably the most famous one. It seems to me that very few people agree that there were five murders. You know, some people say that there were four murders, that Liz Stride wasn't a Jack the Ripper victim, and other people like Randy Williams will say that there was about 13 or 14. And he he goes into a lot of detail as to why he thinks that is. I lean more towards Randy Williams. I definitely think there was more than five. I do think Liz Stride was a Jack the Ripper victim as well. Um, so yeah, it did go on for a long time, and it was never solved, obviously, as far as we know.
The police docket at the time, called the Whitechapel murders, actually contained 11 murders between 1888 and 1891. Yeah, and some say that, but some say these numbers were inflated, even say that five was inflated, as you said, because they don't think that Stride or Kelly should have been included as canonical. Yeah, so you'd say 13 or 14, is it, by the same culprit?
It wouldn't surprise me. I can't say for definite. I don't think any of us can, but I do think, for example, one of the first murders, before the first canonical victim, a few months before that, a woman called Emma Smith was murdered in Whitechapel, and she survived the murder. Well, she survived for about 3 or 4 days after she was attacked, and she gave a witness statement. And she said she was attacked by three men. And she said that one of them was a teenager and he was the most aggressive. And there was two other guys involved. And she was extremely brutally attacked. I won't go into the details, but she died of her wounds about 2 or 3 days later. But she gave a witness, I think, a credible witness statement, you know, and they all match up, if you like, with Randy Williams's theory. You see, I've always believed, Richard, that Jack the Ripper was carried out by more than one person.
I think
Really,
it's three or four people, isn't it, that Randy Williams would say.
he says that three people carried out the murders and they were funded by a fourth person. I think his name is Prince Protopkin, something like that. It was a Russian guy.
Yeah, is it Peter Kropotkin, is it?
That's the
Hang
one.
on,
Yeah,
I've
thank
got
you.
it.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Cheers.
he's a famous
Yeah,
philosopher, isn't he, really?
yeah, he's quite well known. He was probably the world's leading communist, anarchist, socialist, whatever, very leftist kind of philosopher, if you like. Um, and he apparently arranged the murders. Um,
I
there's
think
also a
Randy
train of
Williams, in your interview with him, described Kropotkin as an anarchist out to destroy England and
yes,
was imprisoned for organizing political assassinations.
yes,
That was kind of the logic behind the murders, was it?
um, yes, pretty much from Randy's angle. That's how he kind of frames the whole thing. There's also something that's another theory that's kind of links onto this one, if you like, which I find very interesting. Extremely difficult to prove, but nevertheless, it's very interesting. There was, I think, a British author who was kind of like a socialite. He mixed up in the very highest parts of society, and that's all on record. And he wrote something. He came across or was given some papers so, that were written by the Russian secret police. And in it, Rasputin had written this thing. And he said that Russia were behind the murders because there was some feud between the Russian and British police, of which he didn't really go into in any detail. And he said that a Russian secret agent, I suppose, called Pedachenko, carried out the murders, but he was assisted by a man and a woman called Sarah. And this Sarah woman would approach the women. So, because, I mean, I don't want to digress too much. I could talk about this all day, mate. But basically, if you know Whitechapel, even now, it's a very small area of London. It's very small. You could walk around it in about 10, 15 minutes. It's not a big place. Back then, obviously, there were no motorized vehicles. It was very quiet. It was extremely dark at night because there was no lighting. You had the London smog back in those days as well from industrial pollution, whatever. So it's very hard to understand how a person would be able to carry out those murders in that kind of an environment without being caught. I mean, apparently he was carrying out some of these murders about 12 feet away from somebody's front door in the middle of the night, and nobody saw anything or heard anything barely. So it's extremely odd. It doesn't add up. And that's probably the main reason why I've always been fascinated by it is how on earth would somebody be able to carry that out and not be caught, you know? I mean, it's true that the police didn't have forensics in those days. You know, it was actually about a year or two before fingerprinting became available to the police. So they were just out of luck with that. So yeah, so anyway, I think the idea of possibly a woman approaching the victims to lull them into a false sense of security, if you like, is quite an interesting theory, and it's written by this author. He says that's how they were carried out, and that as I was going back to what I was saying, that scenario kind of links in, if you like, with Randy's work to a certain extent. And one of the interesting things about that is that Louis Diemschutz, who was the main ripper according to Randy Williams, his wife was called Sarah. So there's another little coincidence there, possibly.
So we could say that Louis Diemschutz is essentially Jack the Ripper, then, can we?
If you go with Randy's theory, and I can't say Randy is correct, but having been interested in Jack the Ripper on and off for 35 years, for me, it's the best theory that I've ever come across. But I've always thought that it was carried out by more than one person, and for the reasons I've just explained, but also because of the Liz Stride murder. Because with the Liz Stride murder, which took place down Berners Street in Whitechapel, we have witnesses to at least to the initial moment of attack, if you like. So there was a guy called Israel Schwartz, a Jewish immigrant who was living in Whitechapel at the time, who uh, walked into Berners Street, came around the corner, and saw a man in the street by the pavement attacking a woman on the floor. And opposite the man and woman was another man who was apparently smoking a clay pipe only about 12 feet away and just watching the whole thing unfold, completely unfazed. Like, whatever, I don't care. Um, but as the guy that was attacking Liz Stride noticed Schwartz coming towards them, he turned round to the other guy who was watching and whispered, Lipski. Lipski, Lipski. Now, Lipski was another person that had lived in Whitechapel until he was found guilty of murdering his landlady. So Randy says that basically the man on the ground shouting Lipski to the other guy was like, if you put that into a modern day context, that was like somebody shouting Che Guevara, George Floyd, because Lipski was kind of like what's the word, like an icon or a martyr, I suppose, if you like, because they believed that he was innocent. So they used that kind of keyword. Um, and then basically, I think the guy that was watching with the clay pipe ran off. Schwartz ran off. There was another guy that came walking down the street that ran off as well. But then 10 minutes later, Louis Diemschutz discovered Liz Stride's body, and she'd had a throat cut, but there were no mutilations. I think because the murder was disturbed. So, he finished her off and then ran, and then came back on his horse and cart and said, "Oh, look, I found the body." The double event, the way that, because there was two murders that night. Liz Stride was the first. Another murder that took place 45 minutes later, I think, was Catherine Eddowes. That took place just outside of Whitechapel in the city of London, but only about kind of 15 minutes walk away from Burner Street. And the way Randy tells that story of how they pulled it off is really, really clever. And so the other two guys killed Edos. They went off and killed Edos, while Louis Dimschutz was there giving his witness statement to the police about the Liz Stride murder, thereby kind of acquitting himself of any guilt or blame. You know, he was taking himself out of the investigation, if you like. So it was all very cleverly plotted, and I mean, Randy's come up with so many little facts and things to do with Dean Schutz and the other two, and I personally think if he's not completely correct, he's over the target big time. So he's very close if he's not completely accurate with his theory.
You talk a bit there about the mutilations. Was there any particular logic or symbolism to these, or was it just like a pure savagery?
I think that I don't think it was savagery. That seems to be the modern day concept of, if you like, the main suspect or the main kind of guy that people look to now as being the murderer was somebody called Aaron Kosminski, who was I think a Polish immigrant, Jewish. But basically, it would seem that he was of very, very low intelligence. Um, and sorry, that's my doorbell. And I personally think that whoever carried out those murders, uh, you know, was not of low intelligence. There's lots of reasons to think that. For example, most of the coroners involved in the murders said that the murderer had at least some form of anatomical knowledge. That was and more than one of them said that. I've always thought that as well. Um, to go deeper into that would mean we'd have to talk about some pretty horrible details. Um, but I do think that whoever carried it out was very meticulous in their planning because you couldn't just randomly attack women in the street and mutilate them without being caught. I mean, it's just crazy to think that because is a small area and it was densely populated. There were lots of what are those places called? Doss houses. And some of the Doss houses in Whitechapel, you'd have over, hundreds of people living in these Doss houses.
It was
So,
extremely overcrowded, that's what they say.
yes, yeah. So the idea of somebody just going up and attacking a prostitute, cutting her throat, and then, doing all these various mutilations on her body, if it was just one person in the complete pitch black, Richard, remember, there's no street lights. So, well, there's the odd gas lamp, but I mean, it was pretty much pitch black. But of course, if you had somebody holding a light for you to carry out the mutilations, and if you had somebody else a few feet away looking out, just in case somebody turns up unexpected, then it all kind of makes sense to me. So I've always thought that there was more than one person involved. I've forgotten your question now, sorry.
Well, there are apparently hundreds of letters that claim to have been written by the killer himself. But the best known are the Dear Boss letter, Saucy Jackie postcard, and the From Hell letter. That was sent to the vigilante Lusk with half a kidney. Um, are those letters real?
With the George Lusk letter, that's the From Hell one, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. With that one, if you read it, the person who wrote that letter is mocking Lusk because they're kind of writing with almost like Irish slang. And Lusk was Irish. He was an Irish immigrant. So they're kind of, whoever wrote that letter is taking the mickey out of Lusk because, you're not going to catch me. And he does it with kind of like a derogatory kind of Irish slang at times in that letter. If you read it in an Irish accent, it makes perfect sense. So I don't know if that was the murderer, but they definitely knew who Lusk was. That's for certain. The Saucy Jack one's interesting because that in that letter it predicts the double event, and I think the police. I can't remember now if the police received that just after or just before it happened, but it was written and sent just before that happened. So how would they know that two women were about to be killed on the same night. So I do believe that that's almost certainly was written by one of the murderers. Um, I think a lot of the other letters are probably, completely and utterly rubbish, but those are the two or three that most ripperologists concentrate on.
Brilliant. You mentioned Aaron Kaminsky a bit there, didn't you? You described him as being low intelligence. He's also said to have been a paranoid schizophrenic, and he was later held in an asylum.
Hmm.
And they did say that some of his mitochondrial DNA was found on a shoal, that supposedly also belonged to Catherine Eddowes, although much of this has been heavily criticised by other experts. I don't know if you've got a view on that at all.
Well, from what I've seen, Richard, the ripperologists that I really kind of consider to be, top notch on the ball, they don't take it seriously at all because that show has been handled by so many people in the last 137 years or whatever it is that it's highly unlikely. I think they matched DNA to somebody that had come from Eastern Europe or Russia, possibly. But then, so they kind of pinned it on Kuzminski. But the three guys that I'm talking about, that Randy Williams talks about, were from that part of the world as well. There was lots of Jewish immigrants living in Whitechapel at the time. So to pin it on this guy, I think is probably a load of old rubbish.
Fair enough. Um, the murders got unprecedented media coverage at the time, didn't they? A lot of it was sensationalized too. Um, did that influence the public perception of the murders, do you think?
I think it almost certainly did. It was a very interesting time in terms of the printed press because I think around that particular time in our history, many people were becoming literate for the first time. So they could actually, access news and stuff for the first time ever. And I think a lot of what we see in newspapers today probably goes all the way back to that with the sensationalism that you just mentioned there. So I think sometimes it may have possibly hindered the police's investigation into the murders. But looking back on it now, there are all sorts of things recorded in there that are very interesting and can be used to try and research the case. So even for ripperologists today, they're a very valid source of information.
Paul, you were writing a book on this, weren't you? How is
Yeah.
that going? Should I
Oh,
ask?
no, it stopped. I didn't. I was very excited at the time because as I said, I've been interested in Jack the Ripper for a very long time. Unfortunately, my co-author, because I haven't written a book before, and it wasn't actually my idea. It was my co-author's idea, and then for various reasons, personal and other, she had to pull out of the project. Not long after it first started. It was also going to be a fictional account as well, which I was never completely comfortable with. That because that can go one of two ways, I think, that can either sink or whatever. So, but I'd always imagined that I'd write a non-fictional account of the murders. But then the only problem with that is there's so many books on Jack the Ripper out there. I mean, literally, there's probably over 100 published every single year because this case has generated so much interest over the last century or so. Um, but it'll probably be something that I will do in the future. I think it's quite challenging because, as I've said, so much has been written about it. You've got to come and try and come at it from your own angle. And I'm quite invested in Randy Williams' theory. But of course, Randy wrote a fictional book on his theory. Um, I'm not currently talking to him at the moment, so he probably won't watch this. And I think that was a mistake because I think if you've really got a genuinely good, theory about something like Jack the Ripper, you should write a non-fictional account because if you write it as fiction, people might just take it as fiction.
You could even do like an article, I suppose, couldn't you? And then if you wanted to expand on it later as a book, you could do that.
That's a very good idea. Thanks for that. I'll make a note of that. Yeah, because yeah, I mean, there's quite a few. I'm really into the early Christian British Church as well, and I'd like to write a book about that at some point as well, or have a go. So yeah, I think start small and then build your way up is probably a good idea.
Absolutely.
Mm.
So we've talked a lot about death now. Uh, Death is perhaps the greatest mystery of all. What happens to us after we shed our mortal coil? Is there life after death? There are different views, of course, but we can't know for sure. But perhaps you are better placed than most to shed some light on this, as in a way you've lifted the veil between the realms of the living and the dead. I am, of course, talking about your past life regression with Maria Wheatley. So, can you tell us about your past life, please?
Well, first of all, I'm not fully convinced that it was a past life I was experiencing. Um, it could have been that I was accessing some sort of collective consciousness memory. I don't know. I had a conversation with somebody we both know, Charles Evans Gunther, about this, and he said to me, "The imagination is a wonderful thing, Paul." But at the time, there is a funnier side to, or strange, very strange side to this story. But yeah, M Maria Wheatley is somebody I have an enormous amount of respect for many reasons. And she's done past life regressions, I think, for decades now. She's done it for a very long time. It was an interesting experience. It wasn't what I was experiencing wasn't moving like in a linear kind of fashion. I don't think I was seeing flashes of things, and not necessarily. I'm not convinced in like any sort of order as such. But yeah, I found myself on a field in France being shot at in the First World War. Just my luck, yeah. But I do that. There was some very vivid moments about it, and one of them I remember being in the field and running towards the enemy, but feeling machine gun fire all of a sudden coming close to me. And at one point, I could feel the heat of the bullets. And I
Wow.
remember just throwing myself down on the ground, or possibly I'd been shot, I don't know, but throwing myself down on the ground into the mud. And then I was off marching somewhere else as if, you know. So I don't know. What I would say, because I've got a feeling, Richard, you're slightly skeptical about this, and I can understand that. I can definitely understand that. It's worth experiencing. But there were two strange things that happened afterwards that I'll mention. So the first one was for about 2 or 3 days afterwards, I felt ill. And I've not had a cold or a flu for 20 years now. So that was weird. There was no reason for it. And I just felt so fatigued that I could barely move. And the other thing was, and this is really odd, right? And this is like anecdotal, I've got no proof for it, but I happened to be watching a horror film about 2 weeks after the experience. It was, I think it was a 70s Hammer horror film with Oliver Reed in it. And in this film, it centered around a house. And the house has some sort of bad energy or it's haunted now. Can't remember now. But there was one particular scene where the camera is at the top of the stairs and it's looking down on this room. And the room was the room that Maria told me to imagine as my safe space. If anything went wrong in the past life regression, I could go into this room and I'd be safe. And so I pictured this room. And when I saw the room in this film, it wasn't similar, it was identical, down to the tiniest little detail. And I thought, how on earth has that happened? That's really, really weird. That, I've seen this room in this film 2 weeks after the regression, and it's exactly the room that I pictured during the regression, down to the minutest detail. That's weird. So I don't know. I don't know if it's as simple to say that if you have a past life regression, you're going to be regressed into one of your own past lives. I'm not saying that's a definite thing, but I do think there's something going on with it in terms of you kind of you tap into some sort of, I don't know, collective consciousness. I don't know.
Because it was kind of billed as that maybe you were accessing your own soul. Is it from a previous time? Is that what happens? Like a rebirth?
Yeah, you're going
Like
back
a
to a
re
previous life.
Yeah, it's like a reincarnation almost. Does it tie in with that?
Well, I suppose it would do if you're going back into a previous life, you're here again. So I guess,
Yeah.
yeah, that goes along with reincarnation. Yeah,
The actual process of it seemed like a hypnotism or something similar to that.
it is similar. It's similar. It's yeah, I would say so. I mean, I didn't feel hypnotized. The funny thing was, I mean, I mentioned the room that could be used as a safe space. Um, but that didn't come up in my thinking, despite I was, the fact that I was being shot at by machine guns. I
Hmm.
didn't feel as though I needed to go back into that room because I wasn't experiencing pain. I felt the heat of the bullets. That was tangible. That was probably the most realistic aspect of it was the actual heat coming from the bullets. That was weird. So yeah, I'm open to any kind of interpretation. I honestly don't know what it was that I experienced. I experienced something. If it was my imagination, then my imagination is much better than I thought it was. So I honestly don't know, but it felt real. And as I say, I didn't feel well for about 2 or 3 days afterwards, which, was quite odd.
So it's fair to say maybe you were a little bit disappointed with your past life.
Yeah, well, some people say, "Oh, I was Cleopatra, or I was Robert of Gloucester, or I was
Yeah.
Henry VIII, and I was just some ordinary bloke being shot at in a field in France." So,
If you
yeah,
could have been anyone in a past life and experienced that, who would you have picked?
blimey, that's a really good question. Wow.
If you want, have a think about it and we'll come back to it at the end.
I was getting close then. Um, Harvey Regis or Caractacus, because I think if I could go back and be either of those two guys, then I would be a lot closer to the truth with regards to
Yes.
Jesus and Joseph of Arimathea coming to it and all that kind of stuff, which I find really fascinating. So yeah, there's your answer.
Well, you're great. Yeah, those are real historical figures, but their stories have been developed in British pseudo history, of course. And this leads me nicely to my next question, actually. Because on the CV, you've spoken a lot to the archaeographer and author Marshall Abrahams. How did you come to hear of Marshall?
Oh, I saw her on YouTube. I'm trying to think who it was. I think it was probably Britain's Hidden History channel, I think. And then I saw her on the Richard Vobes YouTube channel, which is quite a big channel on there, I think. And then um, I bought this book. Don't know if you can see that, The Great
Yeah.
Migrations. It's probably reversed. Um, and just loved reading it because Marshall is such a great writer. I mean, she's also a novelist. So she's been writing books for many years. So, you know, I really appreciate a good writer. John Michel is another one that, even if you don't believe in all this stuff, you can really just enjoy his writing style. And so Marshall is a great writer. Um, and I think I was at the very beginnings of my own investigations into our history. Um, and this, of course, goes all the way back to Princess Albyne and Hugh Godard and some people say, they're legends or myths. Marshall would say differently. I kind of lean more towards Marshall's interpretation of things myself. But when you're going back 15, no more than that, 3,000 years ago with Albyne, it's obviously very difficult to prove that she existed. But there are lots of clues and hints and things that she's found with etymology, and all sorts of place names and stuff like that. So I'm very open to that idea, but it can't be proved, unfortunately.
So it's fair to say the theme of those interviews is the belief in the historicity of these pseudo-historical founding figures of Britain, the Trojan refugee Brutus, and an even earlier founding figure that most would say is an historical called Albyne. That's right,
Mm.
isn't it?
Hmm.
Okay, so what do you believe was the real founding of Britain then? Do you
Hmm.
go along with these at all?
I think there's more evidence for Brutus, Richard. I do. You know, Albyne's a very tricky one, but Brutus, I think, because you've got various things like, as I understand it, in this country, he was accepted as being historical up until maybe 200 or 300 years ago, possibly even more recent than that. And you've also got French chroniclers, and even I think in some Spanish histories, he's mentioned as being historical. And you've got the Lemnos stone that was discovered, I think, trying to remember when now, more recently, and that tells the story or matches up with the story of Brutus's migration to Britain. So I do think there are some things out there that um, kind of point to him being more than just a myth, shall we say. I know he's mentioned by Pope Eleutherius, I think his name is, in the second century, or either that or Pope Eleutherius referred to as gens Bruti, I think it is, which means descended from Brutus. Um,
Yeah, I
so there
think
would
well,
go
what
on.
we get in a lot of these accounts is an attempt to explain the place name Britain, isn't it? And they
Yeah.
kind of etymologize it with a founding figure then. So they say this Brutus. I think the earliest account is maybe the story of Britannum that gives us details on Brutus being the Trojan refugee. And then Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britanniae gives an even fuller account again. So what it does is it ties in British history with the classical world. So it ties in with the Aeneid, that was the founding of Rome. And then before that, the Trojan War, obviously by Homer, gives the account of the fall of Troy. So yeah, that's what it tries to do. I spoke to Edwin Pace recently, and we briefly talked about it. And I think we both kind of agree it's a very old story. Probably goes back to, I would say, maybe Roman times, because I think the Trojan War was a particular area of interest at that time in Britain. Yeah, but difficult to prove it as historical. Difficult to go back before that, maybe.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. As I say, I think with Brutus, you know, there are various ways of coming at this, and I know that someone like yourself and Charles Emmons Gunther, two people that I have an enormous amount of respect for, you're kind of, and I don't mean this disrespectfully at all, you're kind of left-hand brain thinkers. So you want evidence, you want proof in paper or whatever it is. Whereas some people will, for example, you mentioned Marshall, will use the right hand brain more to look into these things as well and go and employ alternative methods, I suppose. I think Marshall calls it archaeography, what she does, which is kind of like etymology. Um, to try and dig up more evidence, if you like, for these um, ancient characters. So I'm on board with Brutus myself. I do think he was a real character. The Romans thought they were descended from Trojans. The French did, I think, and the Franks did. So, um, and yeah, for reasons I stated, I'm definitely on board with Brutus. The Albyne thing is that's a lot more difficult, I think. I think Marshall's done a really good job of presenting a case that no one else ever has done, basically. But yeah, that one's more difficult. But I tend to go along with the Brutus migration to Britain.
Another ancient mystery is that of Atlantis. Am I right in saying you've covered this a few times on the show?
A little bit. The odd thing is with Atlantis is I watch somebody occasionally called Dark Journalist, a guy called Daniel List on YouTube. And he covers Atlantis quite a lot. but he doesn't come at it so much from a deep historical perspective. He comes at it from the investigations that people have done into Atlantis over, say, the last 100 years, and the people that have become very interested in it. Somebody that he mentions a lot is Ernest Hemingway. And Hemingway was famous for living large parts of his life in Cuba. And there's a book written by Andrew Collins actually called Atlantis in the Caribbean. And he talks about the ruins off the west tip of Cuba. You've got, I think, the Bimini Road, and you've also got what Paulina Zalitsky photographed underwater in the 1960s, which looks, for all intents and purposes, like a small city with pyramids. So you've definitely got something going on out there, and apparently Ernest Hemingway was out in Cuba for many, many years, and he liked fishing a lot. But what he was actually doing at night, he wasn't night fishing. He was going out off the tip of Cuba with lots of high-tech equipment and scanning the surface of the sea to see what he could find. Whether he found anything or not, I don't know. But Zalitsky did. So, from a kind of a modern, more modern perspective, I do think there are indicators that there may have been a continent or an island. I think it was probably a continent more than an island that existed.
So
Then,
you would say that Atlantis was a real place then?
um, if I had to put money on it, again, I can't be certain. I don't think anyone really can. But if I had to put money on it, I think it would explain a lot. If you look at, for example, the pyramids of Egypt, and other great megaliths around the world. I mean, there's huge pyramids in China and places like that. I think that they may be a remnant of Atlantis. You know, maybe a few people survived a cataclysm and had sacred knowledge or, knowledge of various sciences and technology and architecture and stuff, and they tried to recreate it or preserve it with the pyramids in Egypt and places like that. I think that's possible. Um,
I think our
maybe,
source for this is Plato, of course, and
yep.
he described it as an island larger than ancient Libya and Asia Minor combined, so it would have been a huge place. And
Mm,
it was a naval empire from the west that conquered most of Europe and Libya, but then lost divine favor after an ill-fated campaign against the fictionalized Athens. It was sunk by an earthquake and submerged beneath the Atlantic Ocean. So I think a lot of people see it as just pure fiction, really, and don't know, like a moral story almost.
mm. Like a
I think
legend,
it's
yeah.
meant to have happened more than 9,000 years before Plato's time as well. So we're going to the distant past now. But you think, there could be a grain of history here then.
I think so. Yeah, I mean, um, in that respect, somebody like Edgar Casey is quite interesting to look into. Now, again, some people would maybe like quaff at somebody like Casey because he was a psychic, but he was a world famous psychic, and he happened to predict in one of his Atlantis readings, he predicted the discovery of the Bimini Road, which I mentioned earlier. And the interesting thing about that was that he predicted the exact location that it was found in, and he even predicted the year in which it would be found, 1968. I think he did this in the 1930s. So 30 odd years later, they found the road, the Bimini Road, in exactly the place where he said it would be found, and in the same year. I mean, what are the chances of that? It's very strange, isn't it? You have to think, well, that is odd. That is very strange. And I mean, there are different trains of thought with it. Some people say that it was a war that ended, that basically the Atlanteans blew themselves up, or it could have been a cataclysm that took them out at some point in the Younger Dryas period, I think, around just before maybe Göbekli Tepe. Because we know now that Göbekli Tepe has been proven to be, I think, is it 9,500 years BC? Um,
So would you even connect Göbekli Tepe with Atlantis then, or is it just
it's
proof of a more ancient civilization?
I think that I mean, how did they do that? Nine thousand BC. How on earth did they do that? It's very odd. And I suppose one way of making it kind of understandable is that maybe they were the people that built Göbekli Tepe were either Atlanteans themselves that survived either the war or the cataclysm, or they were descendants of those people. I don't know, but I think it's plausible. I'm not saying it's true, or but I think there is something going on. I think most people either think that Atlantis was real, or possibly that they prefer the ancient alien theory. Um,
What's
uh,
that then?
Uh, well, in other words, places like Göbekli Tepe and Giza in Egypt, and Stonehenge, even in this country, that somehow humans back then were incapable of designing places like that with all these sacred measurements that are connected to astrology and all this kind of stuff. How on earth would humans in all the way back then be able to develop that kind of a system? It's hard to comprehend. But maybe some people will say, and I won't mention names, but there are some very, very clever people out there who've done some work on this and support this theory that there was some sort of alien intervention. Um, so I can see you try not to smile, Richard.
Um, Not in terms of Stonehenge. Well, I wouldn't say it at all, obviously, but I just know a bit more about Stonehenge. I just think that's, our ancient ancestors doing that, of course.
And I would agree. I would agree
Yeah.
with that. Yeah.
Um, shall we move on to Arthur then? Because this is well covered in your streams from a variety of perspectives, in fairness to you. Um, I asked for some inspiration in the chat of your live stream last week, and Merlin's boy has responded. Hello, Merlin's boy. And he asked, who is Arthur? If you had to give a straight answer.
Well, if you're asking me, the honest answer to that question is I don't know. And I don't think many of us, I don't think anyone probably really knows for sure. And I'm quite early into my exploration. I know I've done a few shows on it on the CV, but I haven't read enough books yet to have a really qualified, formulated opinion on it. However, I would say from what I have heard so far, that my two favourite candidates at the moment, and this will probably change in the future, are the Arthur in Geoffrey of Monmouth and Athrois ap Meurig. But I'm not saying that they were Arthur. I'm just saying that, well, they seem like fairly decent candidates. I think excuse me, with Athrois ap Meurig, as I understand it, and I know you'll correct me if I'm wrong, that that particular character in history was in the right place geographically and in the right time period, more or less, to make him a pretty decent candidate.
Yeah, so it's difficult to date Athros, but I think modern scholars from studies of the sources that he's in, the Liber Landavensis, being the main one, would place him too late to be Arthur. More of a 7th century figures, although it's not clear in the sources, and obviously those that support the Athros theory argue that he's earlier. We get explicit dates for Arthur in some of the sources. The Annales Cambriae and Geoffrey of Monmouth dates him to his death at 542, I think. And it's not far off that in the Annales Cambriae, so somewhere around there. And the sequence in the Historia Brittonum places him in around that time period as well. So that's why a lot of people object to the Athros theory because they think Athros is too late.
Well, I've sorry to interrupt you, Richard, but I've heard as well. I don't know. if it's the life of the saints, it's one of those old Welsh books where characters that Atherois is connected to are mentioned within a kind of a 6th century context. So there's an argument between scholars as to when he lived. And I believe that there is some Welsh literature that points to him being an earlier character. But you would know more than me, mate.
Okay, Merlin's boy, are you happy with that answer? Let us know in the comments. Um, yeah, obviously, I think he's a Brythonic war leader that lived in the early 6th century, or was at his height around then.
Do you believe that he was the leader of the 12 battles?
Yeah, I would go along. I think that's most likely.
Hmm.
Yeah, I would say so. I know Charles was skeptical, wasn't he?
Mm.
Obviously, this figure then has had the story elaborated and, it incorporates a plethora of romance, myth, and legend that developed over time. But I think there's a historical root there.
Yeah, me too.
Um, yeah, so obviously, some of the biggest advocates of the Atherois theory were the historians Wilson and Blackett and the later collaborator Adrian Gilbert. You're drawn towards authors like this, aren't you?
Um, am I drawn towards them, or was it just circumstances? I suppose so, in the sense that maybe Wilson and Blackett might be considered to be underdogs in that they weren't academics or they weren't official everyday historians. They were just two blokes who were very, very passionate about British history and set out to try and prove who Arthur was. Um, and so from that perspective, um, I do find them very, very interesting, and I do take what they have to say seriously. And I mean, I got into the Arthur stuff through the Britain's Hidden History channel and Ross Broadstock. And I remember probably might have been late 2022, I started watching Ross's lives, and I just really enjoyed them. I know a bit more now than I did then, but I really enjoyed Rossi's lives, and his enthusiasm was contagious for this stuff. Um, and so yeah, I did really find Wilson the Blackett stuff very interesting through Ross. Um, of course, now that I've looked into it a bit more and I've discovered people like yourself and Charles, Tony Sullivan, people like that, I realise that there's more than one train of thought when it comes to Arthur, and there are very many different approaches to researching Arthur as well. So I'm kind of looking into that now a lot more and trying to get a more balanced view of things with Arthur. Um, but yeah, I just I think the Wilson and Blackie stuff is quite a romantic story in a sense. Funnily enough, I remember watching them on the BBC News when I was a teenager. I can still remember seeing them. That's the first time I ever came across them, and this is going back into the 90s. And my ears pricked up because it's like, we've discovered King Arthur, blah blah blah, on the BBC News. Wow, that's interesting, blah blah blah. So I remember that, and I think about 10 years later I read Arturius Rex Discovered, but I was still probably in my early 20s then, and I wasn't ready to really go into it big time at that point in my life. But I remember thinking, this is really interesting. So anyway, so yeah, so
Yeah, I think
uh,
you're right. There's a big sense of discovery in their work, and that accounts for a lot of its appeal. People liked that, didn't they?
yeah,
And also conspiracy too. But perhaps as time wore on, they tried to deflect a lot from errors with increasingly unlikely conspiracy theories, I would say. What do you believe? Is it better to stay true to the sources or to bend the sources to fit the theory? Because that's what they've been accused of as well, haven't they?
yeah. I think if you're trying to nail something down into a chronology of our history, you have to have proof. you can speculate and you can theorize as much as you like, and I find all that stuff really interesting myself. But it doesn't mean that you can, for example, add it to the school curriculum because these two authors have said, look, it's at Murig because of this, that, and the other, and I don't think that that's possible. Um, Sorry, what was your question again?
Um, it was about bending sources
Yeah, I
to
mean,
fit the theory.
in terms of conspiracy theories, if you like, I mean, I haven't read Where Jesus Was Buried by Wilson and Blackett, and I haven't read The Discovery of the Ark of the Covenant. Um, on the surface, and I've looked into the historical Jesus quite a lot over the last few years, and I'm pretty incredulous to the idea that he was buried in Wales. The Ark of the Covenant, I believe, the idea of it being, or one of the Arks of the Covenant, because some people say there's more than one, that one of them being buried in Wales, um, is slightly more plausible, possibly because of, I think it might be connected to the Brutus migration. And of course, directly opposite to the hill where it's said to be buried, you've got that lion stone, which I think is very interesting, which points directly to the hill. But I haven't read either book, and I think that I think they wrote the Arthur stuff first, didn't they, before moving on to those topics?
Yeah, they did.
Yeah.
One person you spoke to about Arthur was Charles Evans Gunther. You've mentioned him a couple of times. You suggested that Arthur was atheist to Charles, didn't you? I think he flipped the question back to you, didn't he?
He asked me why I think that, I think, and
Yeah.
I've, kind of explained to you today the reasons why I think it might be possible. I will say one thing about that actually, because one of the first things Charles said to me was spell Athrois. And so I went, A, R. He went, Stop! Where's the R?
You
And
failed the spelling test, did you?
yeah, so I looked at the name that I'd written down, and oh God, yeah, it's Athrws. But I will say this, something I found out a little while ago, Richard. I think it may have been the Welsh Online Dictionary, something like that. And it was about these characters in first century Wales. And Athrois ap Murig is not the only Athrois mentioned in Welsh history. There are one or two others. And apparently, on this website I was reading, they spell Athrois the same way that Athrois ap Murig is spelled, ATH, but it mentioned that earlier documents have spelt the name Arthwys, which I thought was very interesting, but I haven't had time to look into it yet.
Yeah, Arthurs is a name. Arthurs is a name. They seem to be different names, although maybe they have been used the same for the different names have been used for the same people. I don't know of a source that calls Arthurs Merig Arthurs, except for maybe one very late genealogy that may try and do it, but it seems like a corruption, I would say. Otherwise, they seem like separate names. Were they the same person? Well, we'll never know for sure. Yeah, it's one of the most plausible Arthur theories, in my opinion. But I mean, there isn't as much evidence for it as Wilson and Blackett have suggested. At least I think that's fair to say.
Yeah, okay.
But maybe they were right. Who knows?
Hmm.
Now, Paul, one of your collaborators is Peter Chesbrough. You've spoken to him, haven't you?
I think
And
I've spoken to him once or twice.
I can't
Once, I
remember.
think. Yeah.
He's asked a question, and we'll end with this because it's a good place to end. He's asking, what sort of route are you going down? So, presumably meaning, what's next for Paul Smith?
Okay. Well, in terms of if you're asking about my YouTube content next year, obviously the CV I think has been quite successful. Um, and I really enjoy doing it. So that's going to be That's going to continue into next year and hopefully a lot longer. In terms of the history I'm looking into, it's a difficult kind of balancing act because I've found these two topics, the early Christian church in Britain and King Arthur, really, really fascinating and interesting. The more you get into it, the more interesting it becomes. Um, but I don't want to be too repetitive on my channel because I could talk about the early Christian church in Britain every day of the week forever. But not everyone wants to hear about that all the time. So I'm going to try and branch out a little bit more as well. I find the Viking invasions of Britain very interesting. I was a big fan of The Lost Kingdom on Netflix. Thought that
Yeah.
was absolutely brilliant. So that's something I'll look to get into in the future. Um, I'm also thinking about making some mini documentaries, if you like, maybe short 5 to 10 minute videos on the early Christian church in Britain. There's a channel that's doing that at the moment on YouTube, but it's all AI produced. The voiceover, the images, everything is AI, and that I don't particularly enjoy that very much. So I'm going to try and do something similar, but more human, if you like. Um, so yeah, that's the plan. I'm hoping to expand my business next year and branch out into shops because we're currently just an online business at the moment. So next year hopefully will be a big year for me with my business. Um, Next year I'm going to Wales again. I'm going to Gwynedd. It'd be good to see you there, Richard. I'd love to get to the south of Wales as well to see places like Llanwick Major and Llandaff Cathedral and places like that that are really old, and steeped in so much history and tradition. I fell in love with Wales last year when I went for the first time. It was actually the second time I've been to Wales. The first time I went, I was 6 weeks old, so I don't remember it. But I fell in love with the place, and I can't wait to go back. I'm also going to the Lay Hunters Wiltshire Moot. I think it's in September next year, which I'm really looking forward to because Maria Wheatley will be there, Dr. John Hart will be there. And obviously we'll be going to Stonehenge and hopefully we'll have access to the stones because they're always roped off. So that I've never been, I've never touched the stones at Stonehenge before, so that would be amazing to do that, to get up close to them. So yeah, lots to look forward to. I'm pretty much making it up as I go along.
Brilliant. Well, Paul, big thanks for coming on. You've given us a lot to think about today. Guys, have a look at Paul's channels, give him a sub. Paul, did you want to play us out
Players out.
with a guitar?
Not really, no.
All
You'll
right,
have to
Paul.
wait till
It's
Christmas for the Christmas
all right.
song.
We'll have to wait till Christmas then. All right, Paul. Big thanks for coming on. Ta-ra.
Cheers, mate. Thank you.